Well, thanks again for the introduction. So my name is Meha Jain. I'm an assistant professor at the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. And I decided to slightly change the topic of my talk today just to fit a little bit better with what I think you were hoping for in this seminar. So I'm going to just focus on aspects of my work where we use satellite data for impact evaluation of sustainable intensification strategies on the ground. So why is this important? Well, there are many interventions or policies being promoted by agricultural extension agents, development organizations, and policymakers to improve agricultural production across the world. But oftentimes the evaluation of impacts of these different interventions or policies are limited. And partly this is because of the difficulty in obtaining data that you care about in terms of the outcome. So for example, you might have a development organization go in and give a new fertilizer, a new type of fertilizer to farmers, and they might evaluate the impact of that intervention in a certain region or maybe in one time year. But in reality, if we really want to understand how well an intervention is doing, we would ideally like to see, impacts across multiple regions to understand the generalizability of these interventions, and then also try to understand how these interventions perform across time. So satellite data can offer a low-cost way to obtain such outcome data that we might care about with these sorts of interventions. So here I've given just an example of some of the different data sets that we've created in my lab. So we've measured yield using remote sensing. We've measured cropped area, or basically the amount of area planted in a given season, and then also sowing date. And we then link these data with different interventions or policies that have been done on the ground to try to understand their impact at large spatial and temporal scales. So today I'm going to give two examples of projects that have basically used this approach, and they do focus on India. A lot of my work does focus on India. Everything's in smallholder systems. We do have projects in Ethiopia and Mexico and some other countries as well, but really the bulk of our work is in India. And I'm going to be focusing on two projects. So one is thinking about ways that we can increase wheat production in the face of climate change. And the reason this is really important is wheat is one of the crops that will be most negatively impacted by warming temperatures. In India, studies have estimated that wheat yields have already declined by about 5% due to warming temperatures and will decrease by about 20% moving forward because of projected warming. And the second project, it looks like some text got cut off, but the second project is trying to understand some potential policies that we can promote to maintain agricultural production in the face of groundwater depletion. And the reason I'm focused on these two questions and why I'm focused on India is because Indian agriculture, particularly Indian wheat, will face some of the largest negative impacts from warming temperatures. So this is just a map showing projected yield loss of staple grains globally, with countries that are more in red, or regions that are more in red, being areas that are projected to face large losses. And you can see that South Asia is one region that really pops up on the map. And simultaneously, India is also the world's largest consumer of groundwater, with large-scale overexploitation for irrigation. So this also is a global map where unsustainable water consumption is highlighted in pink. And you can see, once again, India is really popping up as a hotspot. So, and once again, just to reiterate, we're trying to understand what are some interventions that can help either maintain or increase production sustainably in the face of these challenges. So for this first project, we're discussing ways that we can increase wheat production in the face of climate change. The specific project I'm presenting today isn't an intervention to reduce the negative impacts of heat stress. It's more of an intervention just to increase overall yields. But this is still a really exciting goal, given that yield gaps, or basically the amount of yield that can be increased in these areas, is particularly large. Studies estimate that yield gaps can be closed by 20% if you get the right types of management in farmers' hands. So in partnership with CIMMYT, they're the International Wheat and Maize Breeding Institute headquartered in Mexico, but they have regional offices in India. We ran a split plot experiment with 150 farmers in Bihar, which is in northeastern India. And what we did was we worked with them to use a new way or a new method to apply fertilizers in their field. So typically in this region, farmers are mostly hand broadcasting their fertilizers. But many scientists and researchers have thought that this might be suboptimal because it could lead to clumping in part of the fields and uneven application. So CIMMYT developed, in partner with some agricultural extension agents in the area, developed this low-cost spreader backpack. And basically farmers can put the fertilizers in this little backpack. There's a little crank on the side and they can walk up and down their fields. And basically we think it will lead to more even application of fertilizers. So what we did was we ran a split plot trial. So basically in half of the field, we had farmers just do the baseline approach of hand spreading the fertilizers. In the other half of the field, we had the farmers use the exact same amount of fertilizer, but applied it using this backpack. And we then collected yield estimates on the ground. So this was, at the time of harvest, we went out with the farmers and actually weighed the grain in field. And when we assess the impact of this intervention using those on-the-ground yield estimates, we find that this fertilizer spreader leads to an increase of yields of about 4.5 or around 5%. And this is with no increase in inputs whatsoever. So this is primarily by increasing nitrogen use efficiency by more evenly applying the fertilizers across the field. You might think that this 5% yield gain isn't really large, but we actually think this is a really big effect because, as I mentioned, overall yield gaps in this area are estimated to be about 20%. So this one intervention, this one low-cost intervention can close yield gaps by about 25%, which is really exciting. And the second reason we think that this intervention is really exciting is we did do a profit analysis and found that within one season, farmers actually make enough extra profits from the improved yields to actually pay for the fertilizer spreader in 1 year. So even after this intervention, all 100% of farmers wanted to keep using this fertilizer spreader, and they thought it was a really exciting technology. So while the in-field yield estimates are great because they're very accurate, the challenge is we can't really measure the impact of this intervention at large scales because collecting this yield information on the ground is really cost and time intensive. So the next part of this project, what we did was we used satellite data. Specifically, we used high resolution planet data at 3-meter resolution. And we came up with algorithms to basically map yield using the satellite data. I'm not going to go into the details of how those models were run, but I'd be more than happy to talk about it more during the Q&A if people are interested. These bottom two plots are showing our yield estimates on the x-axis and observed yield estimates on the y-axis, which we obtained from those crop cuts on the ground. And we find that we're getting pretty good correlation values. And this is just what our fields look like, both on the ground with high resolution imagery and then with our planet estimated yields. And what we found was that if we did the same impact evaluation, so basically compared estimated yields from when farmers use the baseline hand spreading approach with yields from when farmers use the fertilizer spreader, we found that we were able to pick up that yield gain using satellite data, which was really exciting because this suggests that we can actually use the satellite data to do impact evaluation at large scales instead of having to get that ground data. We then wanted to understand, we saw a lot of heterogeneity in yield impacts. So some farms actually didn't get any yield gain, it was 0%, but other fields got yield gains of about 15%. So we wanted to understand what are the factors that are explaining this heterogeneity in impact. So we ran a regression where we put in a variety of different independent variables that we hypothesized can be important. And the main factor that we found to be important was the baseline yield of the plot. So basically, fields that were lower yielding to begin with were the ones that saw the greatest improvement in yields. So then this gave us the idea of, well, we can actually estimate yields from space. So maybe we could actually identify those low yielding fields a priori and target them with the intervention. And our hypothesis there was if we could use the satellite data to actually pick out low yielding fields and target them, we might be able to get an even bigger increase in yield gains than we would expect if we were giving the technology out at random. So this is just a graphical representation of what I just said. So this is a yield map using that planet satellite data with lower yields highlighted in blue and higher yields highlighted in red, warmer colors. And the idea here is if instead of giving the fertilizer spreader out just at random across fields, which is usually what CIMMYT and some of these other organizations are doing with their interventions, if we could actually find the farmers that are associated with these low yielding fields and instead target them with the intervention. So we did a simulation to see could yields be, further improved if we did this targeting. And what we found was that basically, if we use satellite data to target the lowest yielding fields, we can actually double the impact of the intervention. So here's just a graph of that simulation. On the x-axis is the percent of fields or wheat area that we are simulating take up this technology. And on the y-axis is the increase in yield gain compared to that 5% average that we got from the first experiment. And basically, we find, especially at low levels of adoption, we're getting more than 2 times the yield impact. So yields can be increased by up to 10% on average. So the take-home messages from this first project is that satellite data do provide a low-cost way to conduct impact evaluation at large spatial and temporal scales. And also, satellite data can actually be used to target the intervention to the locations that will be most effective. In this current project, we just showed this using simulations, but actually we're planning to do a randomized controlled trial experiment in the real world this coming winter, where we actually will use satellite data to identify those low yielding farmers and actually give them the technology, and then compare that to a similar group of farmers, but where we give the intervention out at random. And we want to see whether the increased yield gains are actually seen in the real world and not just through these simulations. All right. So the second project that I want to talk about today is, are there any interventions or policies that can help farmers maintain agricultural production in the face of groundwater depletion in India? So as I mentioned earlier, India is the largest consumer of groundwater worldwide. It's already facing severe groundwater depletion in several parts of the country, specifically Northwest and South India. And people assume that groundwater depletion will have large negative impacts, but nobody, as of yet until now, had quantified what those potential impacts could be on agricultural production and whether there were any interventions to sort of reduce this loss. So what we did was we first obtained maps of where in India we are seeing extreme overexploitation and that are expected to have critical groundwater reserves in the next 10 years. And then we then overlaid those hydrological projections with a remote sensing data set that we developed on winter cropped area. So this is basically just a measure of the amount of area that is planted under crops. And we wanted to see how much of this production is concentrated in areas that are facing critical groundwater overexploitation, which will give us an idea of how much production would be lost if farmers lost access to all of this groundwater. So, and I apologize, I'm going through both of these papers pretty quickly. I was doing this with the hope that we would have a lot of time for discussion at the end. So please feel free to ask lots of questions. All right. So what we find is that if all groundwater is lost from these overexploited regions, India could lose up to 20% of its cropped area in the winter season. We focus on winter cropped area because this is the season that is mostly dry and when farmers are relying on irrigation for production as opposed to rainfall. And we find this is just a map showing where the loss is expected to occur across the country. And states that are more red are expected to face larger losses. And we can see that this loss is really concentrated in Northwest and Central India, which really are kind of the bread baskets of the country. So as I mentioned, everyone knows that groundwater depletion is a problem in India, and the government has been thinking of different interventions or policies that they might be able to promote to basically alleviate some of these losses. And one of the biggest policies that has been discussed is increasing access to canal irrigation for farmers across India so that farmers can then use surface irrigation or canal irrigation as an alternative source of irrigation as groundwater tables fall. But when I spent time in the field, I spoke with farmers about this policy, and they said, that would be better than nothing, but really canals are unreliable. They really only provide, water during really heavy rainfall years. Really, we need to rely on groundwater. We don't want to switch to canals. So based on those discussions, I then wanted to analyze at the national scale, what would the impact be if farmers transition to using canal irrigation? So we took our remote sensing estimates of area and linked that with data we got from census statistics on the amount of area under groundwater versus canal production across all of India at the village scale. And what we found was that canal irrigation is associated with less area under production, and also area that's much more sensitive to rainfall. So mirroring exactly what the farmers told us in the field, canals are fine in the years where you have a lot of rainfall and canals are full and recharged, but in dry years, they're really not helpful, and you see really large losses in production. So we then took our estimates that we ran regression results, regression analyses. That's how we got these results. I'm not going into the details right now, but we basically took those estimates and then applied them to that first analysis that we did, where we looked at simulated loss if we lost access to all of groundwater. And now what we did was we said, well, hypothetically, if you then replaced all of that lost groundwater with canals, what would that do to production? And we find that even if you are able to give farmers access, 100% of farmers access to canal irrigation, you would still have a loss of winter production of 7%. So really, canal irrigation, it can help, but it's not going to be the full solution to maintain production in the face of groundwater loss. And this is something that we would not have been able to really put numbers on if it weren't for these satellite estimates of crop production. So the take-home messages of this paper, groundwater depletion will have large negative impacts on crop production, specifically in that dry winter season when farmers are mostly relying on irrigation. And the expansion of canal irrigation can only partially compensate for this loss. We estimate that canals can help by about 50%, but more interventions or policies are likely needed to maintain production in the face of groundwater depletion. And once again, satellite data really allowed us to do this impact evaluation of this potential policy that otherwise would not have been possible if we didn't have access to these data. So thanks so much. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them now at this talk, or please feel free to email me, and just wanted to thank my funding sources as well. Thanks.